piec tysiące palił, z nad głów podnosił się dym. Śpiewał, że czas by runął mur. Oni śpiewali wraz z nim.
Thank you for downloading A History of the World in 100 Objects. Presented to you by History 170, narrator Jason Chabai. Our object in the program is a freezer from around the year 1980 that once held a few scarce items that were contained within them. The Polish people were once able to trade in their food stamps for groceries to the communist-controlled government. The emptiness of the freezer represents the people's desire for democracy and capitalism. Poland was left as one of the toss-up territories post-World War II to fall under the influences of either Soviets or the Americans. Other countries such as Afghanistan, Berlin, etc. also fell under the influences after the country's governments were left in disarray from the war. It just so happened that Germany made an agreement with the USSR to each take nearly half of Poland during World War II. This led to the USSR annexing Poland in 1939, allowing them to maintain control of the Polish government. After the war, Poland struggled to break away from the USSR, which allowed for a quickening progression of communism to sweep into Poland. This regression demonstrated the paralleling conflicts of the Cold War between the US and the USSR. The motive was not only a race of nuclear weapons, but also a race to spread control. Democracy versus communism. The USSR felt threatened by the impact of the US forces in Germany, Japan, and Korea because of their ability to apply military aid to rebellion forces to enforce their democracy beliefs and containing communism. Contrary to this, the US felt the influences of the USSR in places such as Berlin, Afghanistan, and Poland, so the US began by supplying forces to support the borders of these territories. A high school European history teacher, Libby Reinman, had a say on why Americans feared communism.
The American citizens still feared the potential of communism in the Americas from World War I. The Soviets removed their support from the war and their allies to fight their own revolution. This action was seen as traitorous and instilled negative thoughts about the Soviets. Woodrow Wilson passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which allowed the U.S. government to jail those who spoke against the U.S. government and democracy. This fueled the fires of the American population to clear the world of communism.
A history of the world in 100 objects.
The U.S. was caught up in other areas such as Berlin immediately after the war, which gave the USSR the ability to enforce Poland into a communist state. This led to an extremely poor economy, which was controlled by the USSR after they had killed and confiscated many elite officials from the Polish government. The U.S. had a delayed response to these actions due to their concern with Berlin. However, even when actions were taken, they proved to be ineffective and time-consuming. The people of Poland suffered with insufficient food, as demonstrated by the lacking variety of food and lacking quantity of food in markets. The food was rationed and bought with food stamps in these small freezers. The freezers were about 8 feet in length and 5 feet tall. A Polish company made these freezers, but was quickly taken over by the USSR's power when they proved to have profitability to them. The USSR profited off of the sale of parts to the Polish to create these freezers. They also profited off the sale of the freezers. They profited off the use of the freezers to supply the food. The USSR monopolized industries like this and showed their absolute control over them. The freezers proved to have some concern with the constant mechanical failures which hurt the supply of food. The people already had a shortage, but maintaining food was a key to using the food they had rather than creating waste. When the government supplied food came in on trucks, huge lines would flood the stores and into the streets to ensure the people were able to use their food stamps. An anonymous Polish citizen who encountered the shortage of groceries describes his experiences.
Growing up in Poland in the 70s and 80s, I can remember many different varieties of yellow cheese available in the stores. There were shortages, of course, and sometimes you could not buy any cheese at all. Another example was bread. The cheap stuff delivered daily from a government-run bakery to a government-run grocery store and piled in a bin.
These empty, spoiled freezers proved to be a key symbol to the Polish people in recognizing their horrific conditions and then desiring change. In mid-August, 17,000 Polish shipyard workers staged a civil protest of the communist ruling power that hovered over them. The sit-down strike at the port of Gdansk proved to be the beginning of the political party and the social movement of solidarity. The party pushed for civil nonviolent strikes that called for increased wages and the ability to represent themselves. On August 31st, 1980, the leader of Solidarity, Lech Walesa, signed an agreement with the USSR that was meant to meet many of their demands. At this point in time, the Polish began to feel the influence of the world's support. They finally received financial aid from the U.S. of nearly $100 million. Another big supporter was the Vatican in recognizing the Solidarity movement when Pope John Paul II filled the position in 1978. With the growing support from across the world, the USSR felt threatened. The Solidarity movement gained nearly 10 million active supporters. In 1983, the USSR finally removed their agreement with the people in Solidarity. They imprisoned 6,000 high officials from this party and forced the Solidarity movement to go underground. Meanwhile, the party still received support from the US and the USSR. After 4 decades of oppression and 6 years of remaining hidden, roundtable talks between the Solidarity parties with hopes of democracy created the 1989 Legislative Elections Act, which allowed for the first semi-democracy vote to take place in Poland. The 3 parties, Polish United Workers' Party, Solidarity, and United People's Party, took the election in June. All 3 parties agreed to show support for whatever outcome occurred. The communist-controlled parties underestimated the overwhelming support for the Solidarity Party due to their forced presence to be hidden. A textbook with a global perspective outlined the results of this election.
The outcome of the Polish election was startling. Despite rules designed to prevent Solidarity from winning, the movement took 260 of 261 open seats in the Polish legislature. The communist government could no longer govern without regard for the Solidarity delegates. Tolerance of the changes in Poland signaled to reformers throughout the Soviet bloc what might be possible.
With this election, Poland became a symbol and pioneer to ending the Cold War and influence of communism throughout the world. Soon after the 1989 legislative acts, the USSR felt their loosening grasp of influence is mainly due to the US, and pulled their forces out of Afghanistan, which ended their influence there. In November 1991, the Berlin Wall was taken down as the third official symbol to ending the spread of communism. The freezer shows the beginning to an end of communism, leading to trends across the globe of decolonization and regaining self-control. This object is an inspiration to developing human rights through organizations such as the UN and developing countries. Poland is one of the few countries that was able to set forth the example of peaceful protest that claim independence and is a key to leading the wave away from violent acts that swarmed the 20th century and leading them into a potentially peaceful era. Tomorrow, we will be discussing another picture by René Magritte. The picture, titled On the Threshold of Liberty, depicts a man forced to face the weaponry of war at the cost of his own liberty. Another example of the horrors created before and after World War II, reinforcing the theme of mass destruction in human lives of the 20th century.